The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek, Montana, as Katherine Harris clutched her wedding dress, her heart pounding in her chest like a frantic bird trying to escape its cage. It was 1875, and she'd just fled from her own wedding, a ceremony she never wanted, to a man she'd never met, all because of her father's gambling debts. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt road as Katherine ran, her white dress billowing behind her like a sail caught in a storm. She hadn't planned to run away, but when the moment came, standing before that altar with Jeremiah Blackwell, a man 30 years her senior with cold eyes and calloused hands, something inside her snapped. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't. "Stop that, girl," a gruff voice shouted from behind her. "$500 to whoever brings her back." Katherine darted between buildings, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. $500. That was what her father had sold her for, the exact amount of his gambling debt to Blackwell. The thought made her stomach turn as she ducked into an alleyway between the general store and the saloon. The sound of horses' hooves and angry shouts grew louder as Katherine pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the building, praying for a miracle. Then, as if answering her silent plea, a strong hand grasped her arm, pulling her through a side door into the dim interior of the saloon's back room. "Keep quiet if you want to live," a deep voice whispered close to her ear. Katherine looked up into the face of her rescuer, a tall man with piercing blue eyes and a strong jawline partially hidden beneath a short, neatly trimmed beard. He wore the typical attire of a cowboy, a dusty hat, worn leather vest over a simple shirt, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Name's Kieran Tucker," he replied, peering through the crack in the door. "And you're the bride everyone's looking for." Katherine nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, you can't turn me in." I ain't turning you in," Kieran interrupted, his expression softening slightly as he took in her disheveled appearance and terrified eyes. "But we need to get you out of those clothes if you're going to get away. You stick out like a sore thumb." Before she could respond, shouts from outside grew louder. "Check the saloon, she can't have gone far." "Come on," Kieran urged, grabbing her hand and leading her through a maze of crates and barrels toward another door. "My sister's room is upstairs, she'll help you." Katherine followed him up a narrow staircase to a small room where a young woman sat mending a dress. She looked up in surprise as they burst in. "Maggie, this lady needs help," Kieran explained quickly. "She needs different clothes and a place to hide, at least until nightfall." Maggie Tucker assessed the situation with a quick glance, immediately setting aside her sewing. "Of course, come here, miss." Katherine Harris," she replied, still trembling. "Miss Harris needs to disappear," Kieran said, moving toward the window to scan the street below. "Blackwell's offering $500 for her return." "Jeremiah Blackwell?" Maggie's eyebrows shot up. "What does he want with you?" Katherine's voice caught in her throat as tears threatened to spill. "I was supposed to marry him today. My father," she couldn't continue. Kieran turned from the window, his expression darkening. "Blackwell is twice your age and mean as a rattlesnake. What kind of father would give his daughter to a man like that?" "I was sold for debt," Katherine whispered, the words painful to speak aloud. "My father owes him $500 from gambling. He couldn't pay, so he offered me instead." A muscle in Kieran's jaw tightened as he exchanged glances with his sister. Something unspoken passed between them before he nodded decisively. "Then I'll pay the price with my heart," he said, his voice low and determined. "No woman deserves to be traded like cattle. You'll stay with us until we figure something out." Katherine stared at him, unable to comprehend why this stranger would risk himself for her. "You don't even know me." "Why would you help?" A ghost of a smile crossed Kieran's face. "Let's just say I've got my own reasons to dislike Blackwell. Helping you is my pleasure." Maggie moved quickly, pulling clothing from a trunk. "Here, you can wear these. They might be a bit big, but they'll hide who you are better than that wedding dress." As Katherine changed behind a screen, she listened to Kieran and Maggie discussing their plan in hushed tones. "We'll have to leave town," Kieran was saying. "Blackwell won't stop looking for her here." "What about the ranch?" Maggie asked. "It's the first place they'll look," Kieran replied. "No, we need to head north, maybe toward Fort Benton. I know people there who can help." Katherine emerged wearing a simple blue dress and boots, her wedding gown folded and hidden away. Her long brown hair, once elaborately styled for her wedding, now hung loose down her back. "Thank you," she said, looking between the siblings. "Both of you, but I can't ask you to uproot your lives for me. Once night falls, I can try to make it to the next town on my own." Kieran shook his head firmly. "Blackwell's men will have the roads watched. You won't make it 5 miles before they catch you." He checked the ammunition in his revolver before holstering it. "Besides, I gave my word I'd help, and a Tucker always keeps his promises." Katherine felt a strange mixture of gratitude and fear. "I don't understand why you would risk so much for a stranger." Kieran's expression darkened again. "2 years ago, Blackwell foreclosed on my parents' farm when they couldn't make a payment after the drought. My father shot himself a week later. My mother died of grief not long after that." His voice was steady, but Katherine could hear the pain behind his words. "So you see, Miss Harris, you're not the only one Blackwell has hurt." The revelation stunned Katherine into silence. She'd heard rumors about Blackwell's ruthless business practices, but standing before someone who had suffered so directly made the reality hit home. "I'm sorry," she finally managed. Kieran nodded curtly. "Don't be sorry, be ready to ride. We leave at nightfall." As darkness fell over Willow Creek, Kieran led Katherine and Maggie through the back alleys toward the livery stable. They moved silently, pausing at each corner to ensure the way was clear. The town was still bustling with activity as Blackwell's men continued their search, offering the reward to anyone with information. At the stable, Kieran quickly saddled 3 horses while Maggie packed supplies into saddlebags. "We'll head north through Thompson Pass," he explained in a whisper. "It's harder terrain, but less likely to be watched. We should reach my friend's cabin by tomorrow evening if we ride hard." Katherine nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. She'd ridden before, but never for such a long journey, and certainly never while fleeing for her freedom. As she mounted the mare Kieran had prepared for her, she caught sight of her reflection in a water trough, a frightened young woman in borrowed clothes, her future completely uncertain. "Ready?" Kieran asked, leading his horse beside hers. "As I'll ever be," Katherine replied, gathering her courage. They slipped out the back of the stable and kept to the shadows until they reached the edge of town. Once past the last buildings, Kieran urged them into a gallop, and they rode hard into the night, leaving behind the only life Katherine had ever known. The moon provided just enough light to see the trail as they pushed deeper into the forested foothills. After several hours of hard riding, Kieran finally signaled for them to slow down near a small creek. "We'll rest the horses here," he said, dismounting. "We've put enough distance between us and town for now." Katherine practically fell from her saddle, her legs numb from the unaccustomed riding. Kieran caught her arm, steadying her before she could stumble. "Thank you," she murmured, acutely aware of his hand on her arm and the way her heart quickened at his touch. She attributed it to the excitement and fear of their escape. They watered the horses and ate a simple meal of jerky and biscuits that Maggie had packed. Sitting on a fallen log by the creek, Katherine finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What happens if Blackwell finds us?" Kieran's expression was grim as he cleaned his revolver by the light of their small fire. "He won't take kindly to someone interfering with what he considers his property." "You mean me," Katherine said quietly. "I mean the debt," Kieran corrected her. "In his mind, you're just collateral." He holstered his weapon and met her gaze. "But you're not property, Miss Harris. You're a person who deserves better than being traded to settle a gambling debt." "Katherine," she said, "please call me Katherine. After everything you're doing for me, formalities seem unnecessary." A small smile touched his lips. "Katherine, then." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "If you don't mind me asking, where's your mother in all this? Couldn't she have stopped your father?" Katherine's expression clouded. "She died when I was 12. Consumption. After that, my father changed, started drinking, gambling." She sighed. "He wasn't always like this. He used to be kind, loving even. But grief changes people." Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes that it does. Maggie, who had been spreading out their bedrolls, joined them. "We should get some sleep. We've got a long ride tomorrow." As Katherine lay wrapped in a blanket beneath the stars, sleep eluded her. The events of the day played over and over in her mind: the wedding she'd fled, the strangers who'd risked everything to help her, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. She thought of her father, too, wondering if he was worried about her or simply angry that his debt remained unpaid. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her racing thoughts, and she drifted into a fitful sleep, dreaming of blue eyes and a deep voice promising protection. They rose before dawn, quickly breaking camp and continuing their journey north. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails and old logging roads that Kieran seemed to know by heart. How much farther? Katherine asked as they paused to rest the horses around midday. Another 6 hours, maybe more, Kieran replied, scanning the horizon behind them. The cabin belongs to an old trapper named Jennings. He helped me once after my parents died. He'll give us shelter while we figure out our next move. Katherine noticed the concern in his expression as he surveyed their back trail. Do you think they're following us? I'd be surprised if they weren't, he admitted. Blackwell isn't a man who gives up easily, especially when his pride is wounded. They continued their journey, pushing the horses as much as they dared through the difficult mountain terrain. Katherine's body ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she refused to complain. These people were risking everything for her. The least she could do was endure some discomfort. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the pine forest, Kieran finally led them down into a small, hidden valley. A simple log cabin stood beside a clear mountain stream, smoke curling from its stone chimney. That's Jennings' place, Kieran said, relief evident in his voice. We made it. As they approached, the cabin door opened, and an elderly man with a long white beard emerged, a rifle held casually in his hands. When he recognized Kieran, he lowered the weapon and raised a hand in greeting. Kieran Tucker. Been a spell since I've seen you, boy, he called out, his voice strong despite his apparent age. Hello, old friend, Kieran replied as they drew closer. We need your help. Jennings' eyes moved from Kieran to Maggie and finally rested on Katherine. Trouble following you, I reckon. You could say that, Kieran acknowledged as they dismounted. This is Katherine Harris. She needs somewhere to hide for a while. The old trapper studied Katherine thoughtfully before nodding. Any enemy of Jeremiah Blackwell is a friend of mine, he said, surprising Katherine. Word travels fast, even up here in the mountains. Heard there was quite a commotion in town yesterday when a bride ran out on her wedding. Katherine felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but Jennings just chuckled. Come inside, all of you. You look dead on your feet. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable, with a large fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and pelts covering the walls and floor. Jennings busied himself preparing a meal while Kieran and Maggie tended to the horses. So, the old man said conversationally as he stirred a pot of stew hanging over the fire, you're the girl who stood up Blackwell at the altar. Got more courage than most men I know. It wasn't courage, Katherine admitted, sitting at the rough-hewn table. It was desperation. I couldn't bear the thought of being his wife. Jennings nodded sagely. Sometimes desperation and courage look mighty similar from the outside. He tasted the stew, then added a pinch of salt. Kieran's a good man, one of the best. If he's helping you, he's got his reasons. He told me about his parents, Katherine said quietly, about what Blackwell did to them. A shadow passed over the old man's face. Aye, that was a dark time. Kieran was off working cattle drives when it happened, came back to find his parents buried and his family home in Blackwell's hands. He shook his head sadly, nearly got himself killed trying to confront Blackwell afterward, took 3 men to pull him away. Katherine felt a chill at the revelation. What happened then? He worked odd jobs, saved every penny he could. Eventually bought a small piece of land outside town with Maggie. They've been rebuilding their lives, but Jennings paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. Hate's a heavy thing to carry, especially when there's no justice to be had. Before Katherine could respond, the door opened, and Kieran and Maggie returned. The conversation shifted to more immediate concerns: how long they could stay, whether Blackwell's men would track them this far into the mountains, and what their next move should be. You're welcome to stay as long as needed, Jennings assured them over dinner. Not many folks know about this valley, and those who do ain't likely to be working for Blackwell. We can't impose indefinitely, Kieran said, but a few days to rest and plan would be appreciated. As night fell, sleeping arrangements were made. Maggie would share the small loft with Katherine, while Kieran and Jennings would sleep near the fire. As Katherine climbed the ladder to the loft, exhaustion finally overtaking her, She glanced down to find Kieran watching her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. She wondered what he was thinking, this man who had appended his life to save a stranger. Was it truly just revenge against Blackwell that motivated him? Or was there something more? With those questions swirling in her mind, Katherine surrendered to sleep, more soundly than she had in months. The next few days settled into an unexpected routine. Katherine helped Maggie with cooking and mending clothes, while Kieran and Jennings hunted and kept watch for any sign of pursuit. The isolated valley felt like a different world, peaceful and removed from the troubles they'd left behind. On their third evening at the cabin, Katherine found herself alone with Kieran by the stream. She'd gone to fetch water when he approached, returning from checking traps Jennings had set in the forest. "Any sign of them?" she asked, referring to Blackwell's men. Kieran shook his head. "Nothing yet, but that doesn't mean they've given up." Katherine nodded, dipping the bucket into the clear water. "What will we do? We can't stay here forever." Kieran sat on a boulder beside the stream, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "I've been thinking about that. There's a settlement about 2 days' ride from here, Helena. It's growing fast with the mining operations. You could start fresh there where Blackwell has less influence." "And what about you and Maggie?" Katherine asked, setting the filled bucket aside and sitting near him. "You can't just abandon your lives because of me." A faint smile touched his lips. "Our ranch is small and the land's not the best. Maggie's been wanting to move on for a while now. Maybe this is just the push we needed." Katherine studied his profile, noticing for the first time the small scar that ran along his jawline. "You've done so much for me already. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Live free," he said simply. "That's payment enough." The sincerity in his voice stirred something within her, a warmth that spread through her chest and made her breath catch. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the rock between them. Kieran looked down at their hands, then up at her face, surprise evident in his eyes. For a moment, neither moved nor spoke. Then slowly he turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. "Katherine," he began, his voice rougher than usual. A twig snapped in the forest behind them, and they both jumped, the moment broken. Kieran was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun. "Who's there?" he called out, positioning himself between Katherine and the source of the sound. Maggie emerged from the trees, her expression apologetic. "It's just me. Jennings sent me to tell you supper's ready." Her eyes darted between them, noting their closeness and the bucket of water sitting forgotten by the stream. "We'll be right there," Kieran replied, relaxing his stance. As they gathered their things and headed back to the cabin, Katherine felt a curious mixture of disappointment and excitement. Something had nearly happened between them, something that both thrilled and frightened her. That night, as she lay in the loft listening to Maggie's steady breathing beside her, Katherine found herself wondering about a future she'd never considered before. A future not dictated by her father's debts or Blackwell's demands. A future that perhaps included a certain blue-eyed cowboy who'd risked everything to save her. The peaceful routine at Jennings' cabin was shattered the next morning when Kieran, returning from checking the perimeter, burst through the door, his expression grim. "Riders coming." "At least 4 of them," he announced, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "And they're not just passing through, they're searching." Jennings immediately moved to the window, peering through the shutters. "How far out?" "Maybe 20 minutes if they stay on the trail they're following." Katherine felt her blood run cold. "Blackwell's men," Kieran nodded. "Most likely we need to move now." "There's a hunting cabin further up the valley," Jennings said, already gathering supplies. "It's well hidden. You 3 head there while I stay here to throw them off your trail." "We can't leave you to face them alone," Katherine protested. The old trapper chuckled. "I've been dealing with men like Blackwell for 60 years, miss. I can handle myself." He turned to Kieran. "Take the back way up through the aspens. The cabin's just below the ridge, hidden in a stand of pines. You'll find it." Within minutes, they had packed essential supplies and were leading their horses quietly away from the cabin, taking care to stay under the cover of trees. Katherine's heart pounded so loudly in her chest, she feared the pursuers might hear it from across the valley. They moved as quickly as possible through the dense forest, climbing steadily higher up the mountainside. After nearly an hour of difficult travel, they reached a small clearing with a crude log structure nearly invisible among the pines. "This must be it," Kieran said, dismounting and approaching the cabin cautiously. It was smaller than Jennings' place, little more than a single room with a stone fireplace, but it would provide shelter and concealment. After settling the horses in a natural enclosure of rocks and trees behind the cabin, Kieran positioned himself at a vantage point where he could observe the valley below. Katherine and Maggie prepared the cabin, clearing out dust and spider webs and gathering firewood. "Do you think Jennings will be all right?" Katherine asked Maggie as they worked. "That old man is tougher than he looks," Maggie assured her, though worry creased her brow. "He's survived worse than Blackwell's thugs." As afternoon faded toward evening, Kieran returned to the cabin, his expression troubled. "I saw smoke," he said without preamble. "Too much for just a cooking fire," Maggie gasped. I don't know," Kieran cut her off, "but we need to be ready to move again if necessary." Katherine felt sick with guilt. "This is all because of me if anything happens to Jennings." "This is because of Blackwell," Kieran corrected her firmly, "and Jennings knew the risks." He checked his ammunition, then moved to the small window, keeping watch as darkness fell. They ate a cold supper, not daring to light a fire that might be seen from below. As the night grew colder, they huddled together under blankets, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. Near midnight, Katherine startled awake to the sound of a horse approaching. Kieran was already on his feet, gun drawn, while Maggie gripped a rifle beside him. "Stay back," he whispered to Katherine, positioning himself by the door. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped just outside. A soft voice called out, "It's Jennings, don't shoot." Kieran cracked the door open, keeping his gun raised until he confirmed it was indeed the old trapper. Jennings entered, his clothes smelling of smoke and his face grim. "They burned my cabin," he said without preamble. "After I convinced them you'd headed east toward the territorial road." "Are you hurt?" Maggie asked, noticing a dark stain on his sleeve. "Just a graze," Jennings dismissed it. "One of them got suspicious, but I persuaded him otherwise." The satisfied glint in his eye suggested the persuasion had been forceful. "Will they believe you?" Katherine asked anxiously. Jennings nodded. "They were already riding east when I slipped away, but they'll figure out they've been misled eventually. We need a better plan than just hiding." The four of them gathered around the small table as Jennings spread out a rough map of the territory. "Helena's still our best option," Kieran said, pointing to the settlement, "but we need to throw them off our trail completely before we head there." "I might have a solution," Jennings said slowly. "There's a U.S. Marshal passing through Helena right now, Joshua King. He's an old acquaintance and he's no friend to men like Blackwell." Hope flared in Katherine's chest. "A marshal could help us, if he's willing," Jennings cautioned, "but we'd need to get to Helena without Blackwell's men following us there." Kieran studied the map thoughtfully. "If we split up, we could confuse them. I'll head northwest, making it obvious I'm being pursued. Katherine and Maggie can take the longer route through Copper Canyon to Helena." "No," Katherine said immediately. "I won't let you put yourself at risk like that." Kieran's eyes met hers across the table. "It's the best chance for you to reach Helena safely." "And what about you?" she demanded. "What happens when they catch up to you?" A grim smile touched his lips. "I don't plan on being caught." The argument continued late into the night, but eventually, a plan was formed. They would all travel together toward Copper Canyon, then Kieran would break away, creating a false trail for Blackwell's men to follow while the others continued to Helena. Before first light, they prepared to leave, gathering their few possessions and saddling the horses. As Katherine secured her saddlebags, Kieran approached her, his expression serious. "I want you to take this," he said, pressing a small Derringer pistol into her hand. "It's not much, but it might make the difference if you run into trouble." Katherine stared at the weapon. "I've never fired a gun before." "Point and pull the trigger," he said simply. "It only has 2 shots, so make them count." She nodded, tucking the small gun into her pocket. "Kieran, she hesitated, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions she was feeling. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "When this is over, when you're safe, we'll have time to talk about whatever this is between us." Katherine's heart leaped at his words, confirming what she'd begun to suspect, that the connection she felt wasn't one-sided. "Be careful," she managed to say. "Please." "I will," he promised. Then, surprising her, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead before turning away to help Jennings with the horses. The touch of his lips lingered on her skin as they rode out, a beacon of warmth in the cold mountain dawn. They traveled hard for 2 days, pushing through difficult terrain to reach Copper Canyon. The weather turned against them, a cold rain making the trails slippery and dangerous. Despite the discomfort, Katherine was grateful for the weather. It would make tracking them more difficult. On the third morning, they reached the fork in the trail where Kieran would separate from them. The rain had stopped, but a heavy mist hung between the trees, giving the forest an otherworldly quality. "Follow the canyon north," Kieran instructed Jennings, who would lead the women to Helena. "You should reach the settlement by nightfall tomorrow if you push hard," Jennings nodded. "And you, where will you go after you've led them astray?" "There's an old mining camp west of here. I know some men there who'll help me if needed." Kieran checked his weapons one last time, then turned to Maggie. "Take care of yourself, little sister." Maggie embraced him fiercely. "You too, big brother. Don't do anything foolish." When it was Catherine's turn to say goodbye, words failed her. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, breathing in his scent of leather and pine. Kieran's arms encircled her, strong and secure. "This isn't goodbye," he murmured into her hair. "I'll find you in Helena as soon as I can." She looked up at him, memorizing the lines of his face, the exact shade of blue in his eyes. "Promise?" "I promise." His gaze dropped to her lips for a heartbeat before he stepped back, releasing her. "Now go and don't look back." With a heavy heart, Katherine mounted her horse and followed Maggie and Jennings down the northern trail while Kieran rode west, deliberately leaving obvious signs of his passage. The journey through Copper Canyon was arduous, the narrow trail forcing them to ride single file between towering rock walls. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds gathered overhead and thunder rumbled in the distance. "Storm coming," Jennings observed grimly. "We need to find shelter before it hits." They pushed forward, searching for a suitable place to wait out the impending deluge. Finally, Jennings spotted a small cave set into the canyon wall, just large enough for them and their horses. They had barely settled inside when the storm broke, rain falling in sheets that turned the canyon floor into a rushing stream. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the cave and the worried faces of its occupants. "Do you think Kieran's all right?" Katherine asked, unable to stop herself from voicing her concern. "He knows these mountains better than most," Jennings reassured her. "He'll find shelter." Maggie, who had been unusually quiet since they'd separated from her brother, finally spoke. "He cares for you, you know." More than he's willing to admit. Katherine felt her cheeks warm despite the cave's chill. "We barely know each other." "Sometimes that doesn't matter," Maggie said with a small smile. "I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." The revelation sent a flutter of hope through Katherine's chest, even as she worried about Kieran facing both the storm and Blackwell's men alone. They spent an uncomfortable night in the cave, taking turns keeping watch. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-out trail that slowed their progress considerably. "We won't make Helena by nightfall at this rate," Jennings said as they navigated around a section of trail that had collapsed into the canyon below. "Could Blackwell's men have followed us instead of Kieran?" Katherine asked, the fear that had briefly receded now returning. "It's possible," Jennings admitted, "but unlikely. Kieran made sure his trail was too tempting to ignore." They pressed on, the canyon gradually widening until it opened onto a broad valley. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from multiple chimneys. "Helena." "We made it," Maggie breathed, relief evident in her voice. As they rode toward the settlement, Katherine felt a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. Helena represented safety, possibly even a new beginning, but the absence of Kieran left a hollow feeling in her chest that no amount of relief could fill. Helena proved to be larger than Katherine had expected, a bustling town of wooden buildings, muddy streets, and the constant sound of construction as new structures rose to accommodate the influx of miners and settlers. They made their way to a modest boarding house that Jennings knew, securing 2 rooms for the night. "I'll seek out Marshal King in the morning," Jennings told them as they ate a simple meal in the boarding house's dining room. "Until then, stay inside and keep a low profile." Katherine nodded, too exhausted from their journey to argue. After dinner, she and Maggie retired to their shared room, both falling into a deep sleep almost immediately. The next morning, Jennings left early to find the marshal while Katherine and Maggie remained at the boarding house. Hours passed with no word, increasing Katherine's anxiety. "What if the marshal won't help us?" she asked Maggie as they sat by the window watching the street below. "Then we'll figure something else out," Maggie replied with determination. "Kieran didn't risk his life for us to give up now." Late in the afternoon, Jennings finally returned, accompanied by a tall man wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge. Marshal King was younger than Katherine had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with keen eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Harris," he greeted her formally. "Mr. Jennings has told me about your situation." Katherine stood nervously. "Can you help us, Marshal?" "That depends," he replied, removing his hat. "I need to hear your version of events first." For the next hour, Katherine recounted everything: her father's debt, the arranged marriage, her flight from the wedding, and Kieran's intervention. The marshal listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small book. When she finished, he closed his notebook thoughtfully. "Jeremiah Blackwell has powerful friends in the territory, but what he's done here, essentially attempting to purchase a human being to settle a debt, crosses a line that even his friends won't defend." Hope surged in Katherine's chest. "So you'll help us?" Marshal King nodded. "I'll send a telegram to the authorities in Willow Creek informing them that you're under my protection and that any attempts to forcibly return you will be met with federal charges." "And my father?" Katherine asked, her voice small. "The debt is between him and Blackwell," the marshal said. "But attempting to sell his daughter is another matter. He could face charges for that if you wish to press them." Katherine shook her head. "No, he's not well, has been lost since my mother died." The marshal studied her for a moment before nodding. "Very well. Now there's the matter of your friend, Mr. Tucker." "Have you heard something?" Maggie asked anxiously. "Not directly," Marshal King replied, "but there are rumors of a manhunt in the mountains west of here. Blackwell's hired guns hunting a man who supposedly kidnapped a bride." Katherine's blood ran cold. "We have to help him." "The best thing you can do for Mr. Tucker right now is stay put," the marshal said firmly. "I'll send deputies to investigate these rumors and bring him in safely if they find him." It wasn't the answer Katherine wanted, but she recognized the logic in it. Still, as night fell over Helena, she found herself standing at the window of their room, staring west toward the mountains, wondering where Kieran was and if he was safe. "He'll come back," Maggie said softly, joining her at the window. "He promised, and my brother always keeps his promises." Katherine nodded, wanting desperately to believe it, but as the days passed with no word, her hope began to waver. Marshal King's deputies returned from the mountains with no news of Kieran, though they confirmed that armed men had been searching the area. A week after their arrival in Helena, Katherine made a decision. She couldn't simply wait indefinitely, dependent on the kindness of Maggie and Jennings. She needed to establish herself, to build a life of her own. With Maggie's help, she secured a position as an assistant at the town's small schoolhouse. The work was demanding but satisfying, giving her purpose and a small income of her own. In the evenings, she helped at the boarding house to further reduce her expenses. Slowly, a routine developed. Days turned into weeks, and Katherine found herself becoming part of the community of Helena. People were kind, accepting her without question, and for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of independence that both exhilarated and frightened her. But every night, she still found herself drawn to the window, looking west toward the mountains, holding on to the promise Kieran had made. Maggie, meanwhile, found work as a seamstress, her skilled hands in high demand in the growing settlement. She and Katherine shared a small room at the boarding house, becoming closer than Katherine had ever been with anyone besides her mother. "Do you think he's alive?" Katherine finally asked one evening, a month after their arrival in Helena. Maggie, who had been mending a dress by lamplight, set down her work. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'd know if he weren't. We've always had that connection, even when we were children." Katherine nodded, drawing comfort from Maggie's certainty. "I miss him," she admitted quietly. "Is that strange, to miss someone you barely know?" "You know the parts that matter," Maggie replied with a gentle smile. "You know he's brave, loyal, and willing to risk everything for what's right." The rest is just details. The next day dawned cold and clear, the first hint of autumn in the air as Katherine walked to the schoolhouse. She was halfway there when she noticed a commotion near the town's main street, a crowd gathering, voices raised in excitement. Curious, she changed direction, moving toward the disturbance. As she drew closer, she heard someone mention Blackwell and felt her heart skip a beat. Pushing through the crowd, Katherine reached the front just as Marshal King emerged from his office, his expression grim. Beside him stood a man in handcuffs, a man she recognized as one of Blackwell's associates from Willow Creek. "What's happening?" she asked a woman standing nearby. "They caught one of Blackwell's men trying to burn down the assayer's office," the woman replied eagerly. Apparently, Blackwell's been trying to take control of mining claims by force. Katherine watched as the marshal led the prisoner toward the jail, her mind racing. If Blackwell's men were in Helena, did that mean they had given up the search for her, or were they simply expanding their operations? She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the tall figure approaching from behind until a familiar voice spoke her name. "Katherine." She whirled around, her heart stopping at the sight before her. Kieran stood just feet away, thinner than she remembered, with a healing cut across his cheekbone and exhaustion evident in his stance. But his blue eyes were as bright as ever as they fixed on her face. "Kieran," she breathed, unable to believe he was really there. For a moment, neither moved, the crowd flowing around them like a river around two stones. Then, heedless of propriety or curious onlookers, Katherine closed the distance between them and threw her arms around his neck. Kieran caught her, his strong arms encircling her waist as he buried his face in her hair. "I'm sorry it took so long," he murmured. "You're here now," she replied, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "That's all that matters." Eventually, they became aware of the curious stares they were attracting and reluctantly separated, though Kieran kept hold of her hand as if afraid she might disappear. "Maggie," he asked, concern creasing his brow. "She's fine, working as a seamstress." Katherine squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We've been so worried about you. What happened?" Kieran glanced around at the crowded street. "Not here. Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Katherine nodded and led him toward the boarding house, sending a boy to the schoolhouse with a message that she wouldn't be coming in today. Along the way, she explained about Marshal King's protection and their new lives in Helena. In the privacy of the boarding house's small parlor, Kieran finally told his story. "Blackwell's men followed my trail just as planned," he began, accepting the coffee Katherine offered. "But there were more of them than we thought, at least a dozen, split into smaller groups to cover more ground." He described a harrowing chase through the mountains, how he'd barely escaped an ambush at the abandoned mining camp, and how he'd been forced to hide in the wilderness for weeks, moving only at night. "I finally lost them during that big storm," he continued. "Made my way to Fort Benton, where I heard about the marshal's proclamation regarding your safety. That's when I knew I could finally come to Helena without leading Blackwell's men straight to you." Katherine listened in horror to the dangers he'd faced, her hand unconsciously reaching for his across the table. "I can't believe you went through all that for me." Kieran's fingers intertwined with hers. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Their eyes met, and Katherine felt the same connection they'd shared that day by the stream at Jennings' cabin. But this time, there was no interruption, no reason to hold back. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk so much for someone you barely knew?" Kieran's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "At first, it was about defying Blackwell, I won't lie about that, but then—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Then I got to know you, your courage, your kindness, your strength, and suddenly it wasn't about Blackwell anymore. It was about you." Katherine's heart raced at his confession. Kieran eyed the door to the parlor opened, interrupting whatever she had been about to say. Maggie stood in the doorway, frozen in disbelief at the sight of her brother. "Kieran," she cried, rushing forward to embrace him. The siblings' reunion was emotional, both laughing and crying as they held onto each other. Katherine stepped back, giving them space, her own eyes moist with tears of joy. That evening, they gathered in the boarding house dining room with Jennings and Marshal King, discussing what had happened and what might come next. "Blackwell won't give up easily," the marshal warned them. "Especially now that I'm building a case against him for his illegal activities in the mining district." "What about my father?" Katherine asked. Have you heard anything from Willow Creek? Marshall King's expression softened. I received word last week. Your father left town shortly after your wedding day. No one knows where he went. The news hit Katherine harder than she expected. Despite everything, he was still her father, and the thought of him alone, possibly still drinking and gambling, filled her with sadness. I'm sorry, Kieran said quietly, noticing her distress. Katherine shook her head. He made his choices, just as I've made mine. Later, as Kieran walked her back to her room, they paused in the hallway, reluctant to part after so much time separated. Will you stay in Helena? She asked, looking up at him in the dim lamplight. For as long as you're here, he replied without hesitation. Katherine smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. And if I wanted to stay permanently? Then I'd have to find a way to make a living here, Kieran said, his eyes never leaving hers. Maybe buy some land outside town, start a small ranch. I hear Helena's growing so fast they can't get enough beef to feed everyone. The casual way he spoke of building a future near her made Katherine's heart soar. I'd like that, she admitted softly. Kieran's hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his thumb brushing over her skin. Katherine, he began, his voice low and serious. I know it hasn't been long, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. Neither have I, she whispered, leaning into his touch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Kieran leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss. Katherine responded immediately, her hands coming up to rest on his chest as she returned the kiss with all the emotion that had been building since the day he'd rescued her. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. I should go before someone sees us and starts gossiping, he said reluctantly. Katherine nodded, though she made no move to step away. Where are you staying? Jennings found me a room at the livery for now, Kieran replied. Tomorrow I'll start looking for more permanent arrangements and work. Be careful, Katherine warned, if Blackwell's men are in town. I will, he promised, pressing one more quick kiss to her lips before stepping back. Sweet dreams, Katherine. As she watched him walk away, Katherine touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. For the first time since fleeing her wedding, she allowed herself to truly believe that happiness might be possible. The next few weeks brought significant changes. Kieran found work at a ranch outside Helena, his experience with cattle making him a valuable hand despite his recent arrival. Katherine continued teaching at the schoolhouse, finding fulfillment in helping the children of miners and settlers learn to read and write. Blackwell's influence in the territory began to wane as Marshall King's investigation uncovered more of his illegal activities. Several of his men were arrested, and warrants were issued for others. Still, Katherine remained cautious, aware that Blackwell himself remained at large and potentially vengeful. Kieran and Katherine's relationship blossomed, their initial connection deepening with each day they spent together. They were careful to maintain propriety in public, but everyone in their small circle knew they were courting. 3 months after Kieran's arrival in Helena, he asked Katherine to join him for a ride on her day off from the schoolhouse. They traveled to a beautiful spot overlooking the valley, where a small creek tumbled over rocks before winding its way toward the settlement below. What do you think? Kieran asked as they dismounted near a stand of aspen trees. Katherine looked around, admiring the view. It's beautiful. I've never been to this part of the valley before. Kieran smiled, a hint of nervousness in his expression that Katherine found endearing. I bought it. 20 acres, including this creek and that meadow over there. He pointed to a flat area below them where wildflowers swayed in the gentle breeze. You bought land, Katherine repeated, surprised. When finalized it yesterday, he replied. I've been saving every penny from my wages. He took her hand, leading her toward a spot where the ground had been cleared. I thought I'd build a house right here facing the sunrise. Katherine's heart raced as she began to understand the significance of what he was telling her. A house. Kieran turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Katherine, these past months have been the happiest of my life, despite everything we've been through. You've shown me that there's more to life than holding on to old grievances or seeking revenge. He dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. I love you. I think I've loved you since that moment by the stream at Jennings' cabin. Will you marry me? Not because anyone is forcing you, but because you choose to. Tears of joy welled in Katherine's eyes. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Kieran, I love you too. He rose to his feet and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring. It was my mother's, he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. Maggie kept it safe all these years. Katherine admired the ring, a tangible symbol of the future they would build together. It's perfect. They spent the afternoon walking the boundaries of their land, planning where they would plant gardens and build fences. Katherine had never felt such joy, the freedom to choose her own path, to love the man she wanted, to build a life based on mutual respect rather than obligation or debt. As they prepared to return to town, Kieran suddenly stiffened, his attention caught by something in the distance. What is it? Katherine asked, noticing his change in demeanor. Riders, he said tersely, reaching for his rifle. Coming from the south. Katherine followed his gaze and saw a small group of men approaching, 3 or 4, still too far to identify clearly. Get on your horse, Kieran instructed, helping her mount quickly. If I tell you to run, you head straight for town and find the marshal. I'm not leaving you, she protested. Before Kieran could argue, the riders drew close enough to recognize. To Katherine's shock, one of them was her father. Pa, she called out in disbelief as the men approached. Calvin Harris looked older than she remembered, his face weathered and his clothes travel-worn. When he saw Katherine, his expression transformed from weariness to relief. Katherine, he breathed, dismounting awkwardly. Thank God you're alive. Kieran positioned himself slightly in front of Katherine, his hand still near his weapon. What are you doing here, Mr. Harris? Looking for my daughter, Calvin replied, his eyes never leaving Katherine's face, and warning her, Blackwell's coming. The simple declaration sent a chill down Katherine's spine. What do you mean? Calvin gestured to the men with him, Marshal King's deputies, Katherine realized. I turned myself in to the law in Billings, told them everything about the arrangement with Blackwell, about selling my own daughter to clear a debt. Shame colored his features. They were bringing me to Helena to give testimony when we heard Blackwell had left Willow Creek with a dozen men, headed this way. One of the deputies stepped forward. Marshal King sent us to find you both. He wants everyone in town where he can protect them. Kieran nodded grimly. How far behind you is Blackwell? A day, maybe less, the deputy replied. He's moving fast. They rode hard back to Helena, reaching the settlement just as dusk was falling. Marshal King was waiting for them at his office, his expression grave. We've confirmed Blackwell crossed into this county yesterday, he informed them once they were inside. He's not even trying to hide his intentions anymore. One of my informants overheard him saying he'd make examples of both of you. Katherine felt Kieran's hand tighten around hers. What's your plan, Marshal? He asked. I've deputized several reliable men. We'll meet Blackwell before he reaches town, Marshal King replied. This ends now. Katherine turned to her father, who sat in a chair by the window, looking diminished and broken. Why did you come back, Pa? Why turn yourself in now? Calvin Harris raised his eyes to meet his daughter's gaze. Because I finally realized what I'd done, what I'd become. He shook his head sadly. Your mother would be ashamed of me, Katherine. I'm ashamed of myself. When I sobered up and understood that I'd tried to sell my own daughter. His voice broke. I couldn't live with that. Katherine felt tears threatening again, but for a very different reason than earlier that day. She crossed to her father and took his weathered hand in hers. I forgive you, Pa. The simple words seemed to lift a weight from Calvin's shoulders. He squeezed her hand gratefully. You always were too good for the likes of me, just like your mother. The tender moment was interrupted when one of the deputies burst through the door. Riders approaching from the south, Marshal. At least a dozen men, heavily armed, Marshal King cursed under his breath. They've made better time than we expected. Kieran, get Katherine and her father to the church. We've gathered the women and children there for safety. I can fight, Kieran protested. So can I, Calvin added unexpectedly. The marshal shook his head. I need someone I trust to protect the civilians. That's you, Tucker. Reluctantly, Kieran nodded. He led Katherine and Calvin through the darkening streets toward the church on the hill. All around them, the town was preparing for conflict, men with rifles taking positions, shopkeepers barricading windows, families hurrying toward shelter. I don't like this, Katherine said as they reached the church. Inside, women, children, and elderly residents huddled in the pews while armed men guarded the doors. "Neither do I," Kieran admitted, checking his weapons. "But the marshal's right. Blackwell needs to be stopped once and for all." Calvin, who had been silent during their walk, suddenly spoke. "This is my fault, all of it." He looked at Katherine with regret-filled eyes. "And now others might die because of my weakness." Before either Katherine or Kieran could respond, gunshots erupted from the south end of town. The battle had begun. The next hours were the longest of Katherine's life. From the church windows, they could see flashes of gunfire and hear shouts and screams as Blackwell's men engaged with the marshal's deputies. The townspeople in the church prayed, cried, or sat in stunned silence as the conflict raged. Near midnight, the doors burst open, and two men carried in a wounded deputy. Kieran helped them lay the man on a pew while Maggie, who had training as a nurse, tended to his injuries. "What's happening out there?" Kieran asked the men. "Blackwell's pushing toward the center of town," one replied grimly. "Marshall's holding the line at the bank, but they're outnumbered." Kieran's jaw tightened. He turned to Katherine, his decision evident in his eyes before he spoke. "I have to go help them." She wanted to protest, to beg him to stay safe, but she knew it would be futile. This was who he was, a man who would always stand against injustice, no matter the cost. It was one of the reasons she loved him. "Be careful," she said instead, kissing him quickly. "I will." He touched the ring on her finger. "We have a house to build, remember?" As Kieran prepared to leave, Katherine Harris stood up. "I'm coming with you." Kieran looked ready to object, but something in Calvin's expression stopped him. "All right," he agreed, "but you follow my lead." The two men slipped out into the night, leaving Katherine to wait and pray for their safe return. The gunfire intensified, then gradually began to move away from the church, toward the eastern edge of town. An hour passed, then another, with no news. Katherine paced the church floor, refusing Maggie's suggestions that she try to rest. Just before dawn, the church door opened again. Katherine's heart leaped, then plummeted as Marshal King entered alone, his face grim and blood staining his shirt. "Blackwell's dead," he announced to the room. "His remaining men have surrendered or fled." A cheer went up from the townspeople, but Katherine pushed forward, her eyes scanning the doorway for Kieran or her father. "Where are they?" she demanded. "Where's Kieran, my father?" The marshal's expression softened with sympathy, and Katherine felt her blood turn to ice. "No," she whispered. "Please, no. Your father was hit," the marshal said gently. "Kieran's with him now at the doctor's office." Katherine ran through the streets, heedless of the destruction around her or the curious stares of townspeople emerging to assess the damage. When she reached the doctor's small house, she burst through the door, her eyes immediately finding Kieran. He sat beside a bed where her father lay, pale and still. When Kieran saw her, he rose and crossed the room, taking her into his arms. "How bad?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Bad," Kieran admitted, his own voice rough with emotion. "The doctor's done what he can, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Katherine moved to her father's bedside. Calvin's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Bandages covered his chest, stained crimson despite the doctor's efforts. "Pa," she called softly, taking his hand. Calvin's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on her face. "Katherine," he breathed. "My girl, I'm here," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "You're going to be all right." A faint smile touched his lips. "Never could lie worth a damn, could you, just like your mother?" He coughed, wincing with pain. "Listen to me, I need to tell you something." Katherine leaned closer, fighting back tears. "I'm listening." "I'm sorry," Calvin said, his voice barely audible, "for everything, for not being the father you deserved after your mother died." His eyes shifted to Kieran, who stood a respectful distance away. "Tucker," Kieran stepped forward. "Yes, sir. You saved my daughter when I tried to sell her," Calvin said, each word clearly an effort. "You're a better man than I ever was. Take care of her." "With my life," Kieran promised solemnly. Calvin nodded, satisfied. He turned back to Katherine. "Be happy, daughter. Live the life you choose, not the one others choose for you." They were the last words he spoke. As the sun rose over Helena, casting golden light through the doctor's window, Calvin Harris drew his final breath, his hand still clasped in his daughter's. Katherine wept, not for the father who had tried to sell her, but for the man he had once been and the man he had tried to become at the end. Kieran held her, offering silent strength and comfort as she grieved. They buried Calvin Harris 2 days later in the small cemetery overlooking the town. Despite his brief time in Helena and the circumstances of his arrival, many townspeople attended the service, showing respect for his final act of courage in standing against Blackwell. As the weeks passed, Helena began to recover from the battle. Buildings were repaired, businesses reopened, and life slowly returned to normal. Katherine continued teaching, finding solace in the routine and the children's innocent enthusiasm. Kieran divided his time between his ranch work and building their house on the land he'd purchased. Often, Katherine would join him after school, helping where she could or simply sitting nearby, sketching plans for the garden she would plant in the spring. "I was thinking," Kieran said one evening as they sat on the partially finished porch watching the sunset. "Maybe we don't need to wait until the house is completely finished to get married." Katherine looked up from her sketch of wildflowers. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the main room and bedroom are almost done. The rest can wait." He took her hand, running his thumb over her engagement ring. "I don't want to wait anymore, Katherine. I want to start our life together now." Her heart swelled with love for this man who had risked everything for her, who had shown her what true partnership looked like. "I don't want to wait either," she admitted. 2 weeks later, they were married in the same church where they had sheltered during Blackwell's attack. Maggie stood as Katherine's maid of honor, while Jennings, now a permanent resident of Helena, stood for Kieran. Marshall King gave the bride away, a role he accepted with solemn dignity. As they exchanged vows, Katherine remembered the moment that had started it all, her desperate confession and Kieran's remarkable response. "I was sold for debt," she had whispered in fear and shame. "Then I'll pay the price with my heart," he had replied, not knowing then how prophetic those words would be. After the ceremony, they rode to their new home, still partially under construction, but filled with promise and possibility. That night, as they lay in each other's arms beneath a patchwork quilt Maggie had made for their wedding gift, Katherine felt a sense of peace she had never known before. "Happy?" Kieran asked, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. "I never imagined when I ran from that wedding that I would end up here free, loved, and married to a man of my choosing." Kieran smiled, pulling her closer. "I knew, from the moment I saw you in that alley, that my life would never be the same. I just didn't know how much better it would become." Spring turned to summer, and their home gradually took shape around them. Katherine planted her garden, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the mountain soil. Kieran expanded his cattle operation, building a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. Maggie moved to their land as well, building a small cabin nearby where she continued her seamstress work while helping Katherine with the household. The three of them, along with Jennings, who visited often, formed a family bound not by blood but by choice and shared experience. 1 year after their wedding, on a perfect autumn day much like the one when Kieran had proposed, Katherine shared news that would change their lives once more. "I'm with child," she told him as they stood in their completed home, now a warm and welcoming place filled with love. Kieran's face transformed with wonder and joy. He lifted her into his arms, spinning her around before setting her gently on her feet, suddenly concerned. "Is that all right?" "Did I hurt you?" Katherine laughed, the sound like music in the sunlit room. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass." He placed a reverent hand on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered, "our baby." As winter settled over the Montana mountains, Katherine and Kieran prepared for the new addition to their family. They converted the small study into a nursery, painted with scenes from the stories Katherine told her students. In the spring, just as the first wildflowers began to bloom on their land, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Katherine's mother. As she watched Kieran hold their child for the first time, tears of joy in his eyes, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate bride fleeing an unwanted marriage to a woman who had found true love, purpose, and family. It was a path she could never have imagined. The debt that had once threatened to determine her fate had instead led her to the greatest treasure of all, a life of her own choosing, shared with a man who had indeed paid the price with his heart. 5 years later, their land had transformed into a thriving ranch. The house had expanded to accommodate their growing family. Elizabeth had been joined by a brother, Calvin, named in memory of Catherine's father, and they were expecting a third child in the winter. Katherine continued to teach, though now in a small schoolhouse built on their property where neighboring ranch children came to learn alongside her own. Kieran's cattle operation had grown, providing not only for their family but employment for several hands who lived in cabins on the property. Maggie had married one of those hands, a quiet, steadfast man named Thomas who had worked for Kieran since their first year on the ranch. They lived in an expanded version of her original cabin, expecting their first child just a month after Catherine's was due. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, Kieran and Katherine would ride to the spot where he had proposed, now marked by a small gazebo overlooking the valley. There, they would reminisce about their journey and renew the promises they had made to each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Katherine asked on their 5th anniversary as they sat together in the gazebo, watching their children play in the meadow below under Maggie's watchful eye. "Helping me that day, taking on Blackwell and all the danger that followed." Kieran looked at her, his blue eyes still as bright and honest as the day they'd met. "Not for a single moment," he replied, taking her hand. "Best decision I ever made," Katherine smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder as contentment washed over her. From a woman who had once been sold for debt, she had become something far more valuable: a wife chosen for love, a mother cherished by her children, a teacher respected by her community. And Kieran, the cowboy who had offered his heart in payment for her freedom, had received in return a love that would last a lifetime, a price that, in the end, had proven to be no sacrifice at all, but the greatest gift either of them could have imagined.